I'm very pleased at the work that's going on to move towards the Transportation and Climate Initiative with all of these states so that we can start doing something about it. One of the particular challenges we have is the vehicles that exist on the roads today. We all know that electric vehicles, we only have something just over 3,000 on the road registered today, that we need far more, far quicker. I am sometimes accused of being a little bit of a geek. So I got a very large spreadsheet and I tried to figure out what are the most prevalent registered vehicles in Vermont today. So this data here, this is the number of actual vehicles of any age for each of these vehicle types. And you can see that number 1, 2, 3, and 4 are trucks. Well, there are no electric trucks right now that are on the market in Vermont. And that presents some interesting challenges because not only are they 1, 2, 3, and 4, but they're 1, 2, 3, and 4 by far. There's about 25,000 Ford F-Series trucks on the road. There's almost 20,000 Chevy Silverados, and there's just under that of both the Toyota and GMC models. So we have people purchasing relatively inefficient vehicles because that's rural Vermont and having to get through muddy roads and all those other things. But it speaks to one of those challenges as the auto manufacturers are not creating more efficient versions of these vehicles. It actually makes our challenge of addressing the emissions all the more difficult. Now, the next 3 slides, and I'll be very quick because I do want to have the opportunity for as many questions as possible. This ISO New England. ISO New England, for those of you who don't know, is the New England-wide, basically power supply partnership. And this represents the current mix, if you look all the way to the right of the image that you're looking at, of electric generation throughout the state. And you can see that we've phased out some really nasty stuff, but not nearly at the levels we need. Now, I have an app on my phone. I only have like 3 apps. One of them is ISO to go. ISO to go makes me, I'll let you judge what that makes me. But at 8:30 this morning, I produced this image off my app, which meant that when the lights went on at this facility, this was the power source that was producing the electricity throughout the entire region. The big 50+% one is natural gas. The orange, which is the next biggest, 30% nuclear, 10% renewables, and then hydro, 7%, and coal, just under 1%. So as we think about enhancing our transportation fleet, we have to remember that when someone plugs their vehicle into the wall, the power that's sourcing it it's not necessarily clean power. So we've got to be working on multiple fronts to make sure that not only are we electrifying, but when we do, it's good, clean power. Now, we also have this issue. It said something like 7 to 10% was renewables. Well, what is renewables? At the exact same time, I was able to say, of that slice of renewable, what were the sources of renewable power? And you'll see here, 37% was wind power. This is wind being produced all over the New England region. 29% refuse. I'm not sure many people knew that incinerating waste was our second highest source of renewable power when we put on the lights here at Lake Maury. And then wood, 29%, landfill gas, 3%, and solar, 3%. So I say those not because it's important for that particular moment, but as we think about the relationship of beneficial electrification with the actual sources of that electricity, that has to really be on our minds. Now, I'm going to briefly tell you some of the things we did last year. I'll make these things available so you can look in greater detail and forward me questions if you have them. But one of the things we sometimes hear from people who are deeply passionate about fighting climate change is, why haven't you done anything? And to be fair to the people in this room, if any of you have said that, we hear that from almost every group on every issue, is why haven't you done it? Because we all know the challenges are so great and our individual, every year our strategies are not sufficient to solve problems decades in the making. However, just on the transportation front, while we work through the Transportation Climate Initiative negotiations, which are very promising, we made significant strides in trying to reduce transportation emissions with the dollars we already have. The first issue here, and I'll highlight, is the Park and Ride program. This may seem small, but of course, the most fuel efficient and least emitting vehicle is the one you don't get into. And so Park and Rides funded the construction and design of 544 more by the end of the 2020 construction season. That is a 1/3 statewide increase, not to be overlooked as we think about strategies that we need to bring to bear. And I'll put it in perspective. I live in Burlington. 142 spaces are going to go up in Williston. You can imagine the demand there is for those spaces and getting 142 cars off the road as they head south, either to Waterbury, Montpelier, or beyond. There are other ones that are kind of in queue lining up on I-91 and other ones on I-89. So the whole state will benefit from these kinds of investments. On public transit, you can see the significant increases we've made there. But I'm going to tell you, these are challenging times for public transit. We effectively have one large public transit system in the state, which is Green Mountain Transit, which is in Chittenden County and Washington County and a little bit of dabbling elsewhere. They're under some real duress right now in their budget and talking about cutting routes, cutting marketing to get more people into public transit. So one of the things the legislature has done is proceeded with a full investigation and hired some really great transportation thinkers to think about how we get more people realistically into public transit. On the rail side, we're finally inching towards rail service to New York City from Burlington, which will benefit the entire western corridor of the state. These are real dollar investments that are really making a difference. We also set in motion a number of inquiries. For instance, should we provide a time of sale rebate to people who purchase vehicles that perform at a good environmental level with a disincentive for those who are buying cars that are not very efficient? Yeah. That is a very, I think I heard, that was like a straw poll. But I think, let's be clear, for many people who aren't in this room, that is a serious political question, and we're going to have to grapple with that, but it's an important one. I'll tell you one little bit of trivia. According to knowledgeable people at the Energy Action Network, I hope they're knowledgeable because I'm about to cite it as a fact, that the average statewide miles per gallon for the vehicles on the road is just more than 22 miles a gallon. So just think about what that means as we think about needing to do more on transportation emissions. 22 miles per gallon. Did I get that right, Jared?
That's what our latest report says.
All right, so if you trust Energy Action Network, it's 22 miles a gallon. We're also trying to model behavior out of state government to do the things that we're encouraging people in their private lives to do. And a few examples, our own state transportation fleet, Senator Perchlik and I on the Transportation Committee looked at all the state-owned vehicles. You can see here there's 734. We found that only 54 of them happen to be hybrids or electric, and have created new purchasing requirements to significantly boost that. And then lastly, we created two programs, one to provide cash incentives for people who are buying plug-in electric vehicles. That is likely to go live later, well, in this upcoming week. So stay tuned for those of you who have had interest but have been unable to purchase it for financial reasons. Those incentives will come online. We've also importantly considered equity already in making sure that we're not just thinking about the change in transportation from the point of view of those who have the resources to perhaps buy a new electric car, but to make sure that lower income people, especially in rural areas, have access to high efficiency vehicles no matter what they are. And I just want to settle on that one because I find that an interesting example of the kind of difficult challenges we have. Last year, when the Senate Transportation Committee started talking about a program to use funds to help people get into used hybrids that have combustion engines, there were some in the environmental community who said, no, it has to be electric. We said, if you are interested in equity and doing a better job for the environment, you have to also be willing for those who can't afford to buy an electric car to support them to get into something much better than what they have. If you're in a 15 mile a gallon car and you can get into a used hybrid that gets 50, for you, that is a huge environmental improvement, and leaving that person with no options should not be something that we all accept. So we have our challenges ahead in that regard. We did some things that weren't transportation. This is not meant to be focused there, although that's the biggest chunk we've got to address. Working with people like Selena and Zach Ralph, who I saw somewhere in here, and if there are any other House members, doubling weatherization funding, which has been the call for many people in this room for so long. We reauthorized the State Energy Management Plan, which each year is making massive investments in our own state properties to reduce fossil fuel use and save taxpayer money. Extending the advanced wood boiler tax credit, which came out of our Agriculture Committee, and also focusing on the preservation of large tracts of forest land, which historically would have been thought about for their habitat and all those other important considerations, but we're now starting to think about whether they could be important contributors in forest carbon sequestration and the burgeoning thinking about how that would work. So now, and I'm talking fast because I wanted to have questions, so I'm sorry, maybe I'm over caffeinated. But I said that the challenge of how we would fight climate change in every committee was sort of daunting, but I'm going to give it my best shot. And these are, in my opinion, very sincere strategies that are going to be discussed in the 2020 session. I can speak from the Senate side, but I know that House members here will say that this all makes sense to them. So our Agriculture Committee, which long ago, not so long ago, would have been thinking primarily about their focus just on the dairy industry, have taken a much wider view on their policy front in recent years and are very interested in this issue of how to support landowners, farmers, foresters in the new industry of forest carbon sequestration. There's a great working group that's been meeting, and the Agriculture Committee will be taking that up to see how we can support those strategies, which will help farms be viable while we're at it. On the Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs Committee, so this is each of the Senate committees in alphabetical order, just so you know. The promotion of new housing and investment in downtown and village centers. It's often lost on people that smart growth development is a climate change fighting strategy. There is, I should acknowledge, we have lost a real champion in that regard, Paul Brune. Many of you have worked with Paul, especially preserving. He was at Preservation Trust of Vermont. But people forget that all the work he's done to make the villages and downtowns of Vermont, the special places they've always been, have continued to attract people, is actually a strategy to fight carbon change without putting that name on it. So I want to acknowledge all that he's done. On the education side, we have major capital needs to be made at our K-12 school infrastructure all throughout the state and at our higher education buildings. And our Education Committee will be taking a look at how we continue to make progress there. Our Finance Committee, for those of you who are unfamiliar, our Finance Committee has oversight of utilities and kind of regulatory agencies like the Public Utility Commission. They will be looking at the issue of accelerating Vermont's 100% renewable electricity requirement and looking at an important shift in how we think about Efficiency Vermont's mission, which we began last year. That one falls into the category of really significant changes that you don't go into lightly, but have tremendous opportunity to reduce carbon emissions on the other side of it. The Government Operations Committee, not normally thought of as a climate change committee. We have draft legislation that will require as a condition of licensing that people do an education model in the way their particular occupation affects the environmental performance of the state. Just a couple examples. If you're a plumber, you should have to be educated in how the controls on the equipment you're installing draw down demand for natural gas or whatever the other fuel is. If you're a real estate agent, you should know how solar panels on the roof of a building impact the value of the homes. Whoa. I'm not sure if they're for or against the real estate people, but I think I'm with them in spirit though. The Health and Welfare Committee will be looking at resilience issues around climate-related health impacts. Anyone who's seen the data about tick-borne diseases knows that this is not something that's in the future. It's not only is it already here, but we're catching up to how much it's already here. The Institutions Committee will continue to make advances on energy improvement in our state buildings and all the people we fund. The Judiciary Committee, and this is a bit of an interesting one for me, and it's speaking here today that made me really think about how this is something we need to work on. Many of you know that the Trump administration has been has tried to strike down the CAFE standards. That's what this stands for, Corporate Average Fuel Economy. We call them CAFE. I'm not sure anyone could have told me what that meant. I didn't know. But if those go away and the auto manufacturers do not produce more efficient vehicles, meeting any of our environmental targets will be virtually impossible. So our Judiciary Committee will be at the table with the Attorney General's office, making sure that by some manner we successfully preserve that important environmental strategy where California is the leader. Our Natural Resources and Energy Committee has a whole array of interventions in the discussions that many of you have been having throughout the building here today. Among them, in my opinion, are thinking about the policies around battery storage, which is increasingly an important piece of both resilience, but also making our renewable energy more efficient and more appropriate for meeting needs both in rural and non-rural communities. Also addressing in-state hydro issues. Many of you have read about the Supreme Court case, which requires the curtailment of an existing hydro dam so that the water quality and habitat issues will be enhanced. So here you have two conflicting goals. We want the water quality, we also want the clean power. What happens now, because we have a whole number of other hydro dams around the state who are all going to be facing the exact same issue. So that's going to be something that we all together struggle through. Transportation, I talked a bit about some of these things. All I can tell you is that I am actually really impressed with the team of people Governor Scott has had working on this on our behalf with the other states. Peter Walk, who some of you know, was here earlier talking about TCI, Michelle Boomhauer, Dan Dutcher, and others. They are all delivering the kind of, they're expressing the kind of values that all of the people in this room, I think, would expect them to do. And I think it's a credit to the governor. He has selected this team to be at the table. And I look forward to seeing what they do. And then lastly, appropriations, who I say have to figure out how to pay for all this. It's a small matter, but we'll see how they do. So I'm going to just finish with this. I have this one image, and I just want to tell you a quick story, and then I'm happy to take questions in whatever time Joey gives me. So this is a photo that was taken in October of 2009. Any of you who know Burlington decently well have seen the building on the right there. That is 3 Cathedral Square, where I used to work. And it's right on the corner of Battery Street and Cherry Street. And that is a 36 kilowatt PV solar system on the top. The photo with me and my compadres there, if we had been on the other side with the panels showing, we'd be dangling from the front of that building. So we opted for safety. But I show this because 2010 is not that long ago. A 36 kilowatt system. This was the biggest one in Burlington, Vermont at the time. Just think about it. Now it would be considered an afterthought project. But 36 kilowatts was the biggest one in Burlington at the time. And so I mentioned that to say how very far we've come in a relatively short time. So we know how much more work we have to do together, but it's worth acknowledging that, I mean, I'm very pro-government. I believe government can change the world for better, for better and for good. But I would never believe we have been able to move government as fast as we have in the last 9 years on so many fronts. And so I do think that's a tribute to many of the people in this room that you've been able to work with us and push us in those important ways. So with that, I'd love to hear some questions for anything I've missed or things you want to better understand the thinking of the legislature. Thank you.
I guess what I would like to do is say deep gratitude to Senator Ash for being with us today. Yes, please, thank you. I do not think we will have time for questions, but one thing I would like to do is encourage you, to, unless I could. I think we're running way too over time. This is what I'm going to ask you to do. Write your questions on the Slido app, or give them to me, and I will give them to the senator, and one of us on my team will translate his answers or something like that.
All right, and I'll just amplify that by saying that any questions you have as we move forward, feel free to contact me directly or work with any of the senators you have. But it is absolutely going to be the case that The legislature faces pressure and tension from the people in the community, which is exactly the way it should be, and that together we're going to do the best job we can to move forward on all these environmental frontiers. So thank you very much for all that you're doing to support the work that we're doing.
Thank you, quickly, Sheldon? Public service announcement. Somebody else has lost a pair of glasses. There are several things now in the lost and found. These are now up here, but I will bring them down to this desk. I'm going to now turn the mic over because we are going to culminate our day formally together with a great keynote speaker we're very excited to have here. My pleasure to turn the mic over to my colleague Sheldon Goodwin, the political campaign organizer with outreach at Vermont Conservation Voters, who will say a few words to introduce our keynote speaker. Take it away, Sheldon. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I'd like to extend, my name is Sheldon Goodwin, and I work for the Vermont Conservation Voters. And first I want to, can you hear me better?
That's better, yes.
Okay. So again, my name is Sheldon Goodwin, and I work for the Vermont Conservation Voters. And first I wanted to thank Senator Ash for being here and for his comments. I'm looking forward to seeing what the Senate will do in 2020. So I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Rep. Chloe Maxim. Rep. Maxim is a lifelong activist and has been working to push climate action since 12 years old. In 2012, Rep. Maxim co-founded Divest Harvard, a movement to push Harvard to divest from fossil fuel companies. She helped to grow the campaign from 10 supporters to 70,000 supporters. Since that historic campaign, Rep. Maxim had continued to advocate for climate action and received national and international recognition for her activism. In 2018, she ran for Maine State Representative on a climate action platform and won. She ran because she believes that, quote, we need to continue mobilizing outside the system, but we also need people inside the system, end quote. At Vermont Conservation Voters, we work to empower and elect climate activists to the State House. Like Rep. Maxim, we recognize that in order to make bold systemic climate action possible, we need to change the composition of those in power. We need more activists to run for office and help shift what is politically possible in Vermont. We're grateful for Rep. Maxim being here to talk about how to run and win on climate action and why we need more activists like all of you to run for office. Please join me in welcoming Rep. Maxim to the stage.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
My mom always calls this part of the day the Welch's grape juice valley of depression. It's like, can't decide whether you should go to sleep or keep going or drink coffee. So I hope this is slightly energizing for you. I'm so grateful to Joey and Jared for reaching out and inviting me here. It's been a while since I've been to Vermont, but I'm really honored to meet all of you and join you in this conversation today. I wanted to put out a couple disclaimers before I launch into my spiel. The first is that graphic design is not my forte, so please don't judge me based on my slides. I go for pictures, not text, but you know, there's a lot of room for improvement in my life. And the other piece is that I'm about to talk about rural politics and how Democrats and progressives in general can reroute our movements in conservative red America. And so much of the work that I do is co-done with my campaign manager, Kenyon Woodward, who is also an ultra runner and had to go on a run because he's training for a race, so he's running around this lake somewhere. But his presence is here, and I want to note that because none of this could happen without him. So, okay, my name is Chloe Maxman. I grew up in a small town called Noblesboro, Maine, 1,600 people. I was raised on my family's farm, and for as long as I can remember, I have just loved my home more than anything, and I have decided to devote my life to fighting for Maine. The biggest threat to Maine, and I think everywhere in the world, as we all agree, is climate change. So I've been working on this climate issue for a really long time, and my theory of change, the way that we think about approaching this issue, has evolved so much over the years. But this is where I am right now. In my mind, what we need to confront the climate crisis is policy. And what we need to get good policy is to elect good people and build good political movements. I think we're struggling a little bit on that front because the folks that we've been electing for years and years have not done what we need to do on the climate front. And we've obviously seen the greatest consequences of that in the 2016 election. In my mind, one of the biggest constituencies that have left behind that could be with us but are not are rural communities. So I spend my time building progressive power in rural communities to ultimately get the political change that we need at the local, state, and federal level. So I really like to articulate that theory of change because I think a lot of people who know that I work on climate are confused that I work on rural politics all the time. I don't necessarily talk about climate, but to me it's all so related and it makes so much sense. So I really like to put that out there. This link between politics and climate was not always super obvious to me. So, and I think up until recently with Sunrise and post-2016, it hasn't really been obvious to a lot of our movement. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my story and how I got there, and then I'll delve into our House race in District 88 in Maine, and we'll go from there. So, okay. I grew up on a farm, as I mentioned. We raise deer, and those are the deer. They're so beautiful. When I was 12, I got involved with this effort to stop Maine's North Woods from getting developed, and that's how I got kind of roped into activism and organizing and began to learn about climate change. I went to high school, and my rural public high school, and I started this thing called the Climate Action Club because no one was talking about climate in my school or my community, and I really wanted to. So there we go. And actually, when I was in high school, and I met Jared, it feels like so long ago, but that's what happened. And when we were doing this kind of work, we were really focusing on what we could do as individuals. It was empowering, you know, like May, who talked earlier, we did the No Idling campaign, and we did a reusable bag and all of this stuff, and it was good. And you know, we started a conversation, but like looking back right now, like obviously we need way more than that. And so then after high school, I went to Harvard, and when I was at Harvard, I learned about the Trailbreaker pipeline, which I'm assuming all of you know about. Okay, maybe not. So this is a brilliant plan that is now dead, thank goodness. Yeah. But it was this is a picture of an existing pipeline that runs across New England. It's defunct now, but it used to carry crude oil from Portland, Maine to Canada. There was a proposal to reverse the flow and bring tar sands across Canada and through New England. And in Maine, the chunk of pipeline is owned by the Portland Pipeline Company. You think, oh, that's a nice local fossil fuel company. But in fact, that company is 76% owned by ExxonMobil. So this fact blew my mind. I had no idea that the fossil fuel industry had such deep roots in Maine. And this was at the beginning of or going into my second year at Harvard. So that was also the summer that Bill McKibben wrote his Do the Math thing in Rolling Stone, and divestment was really taking off. So I went back to Harvard and I started Divest Harvard. And Divest Harvard was an incredible experience. We started in 2012. The campaign is still going on today. It was organizing at Harvard that I really learned how to organize. Yeah, we'll just keep it that way. So the first thing that we did is we got all the students to vote on divestment, and 72% said, yes, that's a great idea. And the administration wouldn't engage with us, so we kept building power, and this is how I ultimately met Canyon. Canyon hates that I do this, but I've pointed him out in all of my slides so that you can see how integrated our lives are. Because this was in 2012, I believe, that these photos were taken. So the administration was like, no, climate change isn't a big enough issue to warrant divestment. And we were like, you're bonkers. So we started organizing. We did all of these huge rallies. You know, no one was talking about climate at Harvard. Nobody, except some select teachers. So, you know, we were really starting from ground zero. The administration kept ignoring us, so we escalated. We started to do civil disobedience. We blockaded our president's office building. We got 70,000 people signed on to the campaign. Someone was arrested from our group. The first time someone was arrested at Harvard since the Vietnam War protests, and the first arrest of the entire fossil fuel divestment movement. The administration still did nothing, but our movement kept building. So we fasted for 3 days. Our own students sued Harvard for their climate investments. We did a sit-in inside our president's office building. Kenyon holding the banner back there. And then still nothing happened. So we shut down our president's office building for 6 days and 6 nights. We had thousands of alumni coming back to campus, had so many people who were ready to get arrested that we could just hop over and shut down the other administrative building when we felt like it. But we built this massive movement, and just like hundreds and hundreds of people gathering in Harvard Yard to talk about climate change and demand that Harvard does the same thing. Another funny tidbit is that's actually not Canyon that I circled, which is a little embarrassing.
Same here.
I know, they look so similar, don't they? And then, so this was like 2 weeks before we graduated, and Harvard hired a former oil executive as our CFO, and we were all so angry. We can see our faces, we're done. So through all of this time, we're learning how to organize, but we're also on the blockade, like literally as we're doing this stuff, Kenyon and I are starting to get really worried, because what we see is that the fossil fuel divestment movement has been so successful at building grassroots momentum, kind of like around an issue of climate change. But the theory of change of divestment was that we build a movement to stigmatize the fossil fuel industry so our politicians won't associate it with it, that we can reclaim that political space that is supposed to be ours and now belongs to corporations. So we're getting all of this grassroots momentum, but there were no ways to pivot all of that energy towards politics. We weren't running people for office. We weren't engaging with electoral campaigns. So it was like all this power that we built was so separate from our stated goals. And that was really confusing to me. I wrote an entire thesis about it, which is what you see in front of you right there. And the day after I graduated, I moved back to Maine to think about this stuff and work on it, and worked on Bernie's campaign and a bunch of local campaigns, and went to COP21 in 2015 in Paris. And I just kept seeing our social movements be so separate from our electoral politics. So I also started to notice other patterns which kind of can be distilled into these facts. The first is that when I tried to engage with local politics, there wasn't really like a good infrastructure there in Maine to do that. And so that's kind of connected to this statistic that Democrats have lost 968 legislative seats under the Obama administration. I also began to see, especially after 2016, that rural communities like mine were just getting redder and redder, and I could see no way to bring the movements that I was working on into my rural communities. I knew they would die before I ever got started, just because of language and tactics and strategies, they wouldn't translate. And I also saw that kind of thinking being mirrored by the National Democratic Party and how they talk to rural people. So, like at Harvard and organizing these progressive movements that I love and have devoted my life to, are leaving behind the kinds of communities that I grew up in, these rural red communities. So I thought, what better way to tackle this problem than to run for office? So for me, running for office and our campaign in District 88 was about meshing social movements and electoral politics. It's about building a movement that, yes, it gets somebody elected, but those are also movements that are built around issues and what's going on in our community, and can hold that person accountable even after they're elected, can go to public hearings, can continue to organize. So it's like a dual purpose movement. I mean, it's so much better. So I wanted to introduce you to District 88, where I come from. District 88, before we ran, had a 16 percentage point Republican advantage, which is the same advantage that Republicans hold in rural communities across the country. So that's an interesting mirror. I'm trying to make the point that District 88 and everything I'm about to talk about is not random, but that there are genuine lessons to be learned from what we did that can be translated to other rural communities. District 88 has never been represented by a Democrat until me. And then it experiences so many of the challenges that rural communities I'm sure here all across the country face. Lincoln County, which is most of District 88, is the most rural county in the most rural state in the country. We're also the oldest county in the oldest state in the country. Property taxes are crippling us. People don't represent us. Our voices aren't reflected in policy. It's all very, very frustrating, understandably. So I launched in February 2018. There was already another Democrat who had filed to run, so we had a primary. And we set off going, canvassing, doing house parties, canvassing in the snow, canvassing down the dirt roads. We had a bunch of local artists come together and we painted our own signs. So most of the signs that you would see driving through my district were beautiful, you know, they're painted by really talented people. We had some of the boring ones too, but those weren't nearly as popular. We also had these dedicated canvas days. So a lot of what we did was, yeah, I told you I was going to circle his face. A lot of what we did was very intentionally separating ourselves from how the Maine State Democratic Party operates. I love the Maine State Dems. They do incredible work. I think a lot of the challenges are because of capacity and funding. So we decided to do it all ourselves. So we created all of our own universes, you know, who I go talk to, who my volunteers go and talk to. We did that all of ourselves. We did our own mailers. We did everything by ourselves, including our own trainings for our volunteers. Almost all of the people that you see in these photos had never volunteered on a political campaign before. You can also see that a lot of them are young, and that might be odd because I live in such an old community. But it turns out that when young people run for office, all of their friends are super excited about it. So all my friends would come up to Noblesboro and you would have super fun canvas weekends. These are some of the pictures of the trainings that we did. How many here have volunteered on a political campaign before? Yeah, how many of you had fun doing it? Okay, maybe you're a better person than I am. Whenever I volunteered on campaigns, I've gone to like a super drab headquarter, and then I've been sent out by myself, and it's been miserable and cold, and the people have already had their doors knocked on 100 times. And I come back and I get a really bad cookie and then I leave. And it's not fun. There's no community building, and it was just not a good experience on almost every campaign I've ever worked on or volunteered on. So we thought, why can't campaigns be as exciting as social movements? Why can't we create the same kind of community with a structure like this that we did when we were organizing at college, for example? You know, so we would have musicians come in, we would have music, we had people donate food. It was always so fun and so community oriented, and it was beautiful. Here's just a couple more photos, including my dog. I just couldn't resist it. And I love the sign with the lights. It says, "We are glowy for Chloe." That's my favorite. Yeah, you know, we had over 90 letters to the editor as well. And the beautiful thing about rural communities is that we still have printed papers. So we won our primary with 80% of the vote, and that sounds like a lot. It was not that difficult because we just knocked on a lot of doors. We knocked on 10,000 doors in total in our race. But after the primary, I started talking to Republicans and independents because District 88 is only 27% Democrat. So clearly I couldn't get elected just by talking to Democrats. Have y'all used minivan before? Who has not used minivan? Okay, quite a few folks. Minivan is a tool that we use for canvassing, and basically it brings up a house. Like you click on the little dot, it brings up a house. It tells you the voter, you know, their name, their age, their gender, and their voting history. I mean, not really their voting history, but who has contacted them before. So when I started knocking on Republicans' doors, I noticed something super interesting. If you look, survey question history, that one, y'all see that? So you can see on the far left and then the second to the left, there's nothing under that. That means that a Democratic canvasser has never knocked on that person's door in their entire voting history. Isn't that crazy? I mean, why would we expect these folks to vote Democrat if we're not knocking on their door? I would also like to mention that I'm a Democrat, not because I believe in party politics, but because I believe in the values of the Democratic Party. Equal access and opportunity is how I define it. And I think that the Republican narrative is very much undermining that. So I genuinely don't care in my community what party people are from. I care what values we're representing. So with that being said, the second to the right, you can see that that person hasn't been canvassed by a Democrat since 2008 when Obama was running. And then the one on the far right is somebody that's a Republican who had been canvassed by a Democrat, but marked as too GOP to ever go talk to again. So all of these people, I took these screenshots because all of them committed to support our campaign. And even the one on the far right put up my last hand-painted lawn sign on her property, which was so exciting. So I thought that was it just goes to show what happens when you talk to people who we haven't talked to in so long. Like another thing that we did, which I included in this talk because I know that Vermont has pretty small and accessible districts as well. But we talk to people a lot of times to try and build real relationships instead of just something transactional. Like I hated it when I would knock on a door and someone would tell me a heartbreaking story about how they can't afford to go to the doctor. And how can I say, well, can I count on your vote? I mean, it's like too gross for me to even do. So we would make sure that we visited people multiple times. So in the primary, for example, this is my contact history with somebody who was not home. I knocked on the door 8 times trying to see if they were there. If someone wasn't home during our general canvassing, I knocked on their door 4 times. That's an independent who was never home. If I did talk to somebody, so this is a Republican who was home, and I talked to them twice. I made sure that I had 2 real conversations with them before election day. And if somebody was home, but then I went back and they weren't there, and I went back and they weren't there, and I'll keep going back until I talk to them again. So I had to talk to this person, visit their house 3 more times before I had my second conversation with them. But it worked so well because these are my neighbors. They're the people that I share a community with, and now I have an actual relationship with them instead of one that's just based on voting. So we did all of this, and we won with 52.4% of the vote, which is about 219 votes. Thank you. We worked really hard. We knocked down a lot of doors. But to me, the work does not stop when you get elected. Like I was talking about how we can build these movements to keep our message and our movements going. So I spend most of my time not in Augusta, but in my community, or at least I try. So I do coffee with Chloe every month. I'm always meeting with my constituents in my community and going to events and, doing all of that kind of thing. All of the bills that I sponsored this session were directly from conversations that I had with my constituents directly for my district. And yeah, I actually have a senior transportation bill, which seems very relevant to so much of what's been talked about today. But I think one thing that I did want to dig in a little bit deeper on is the Maine Green New Deal, which is a bill that I sponsored and that didn't get passed and signed into law. So that was exciting. But some people were really puzzled at why someone who just got elected in the super conservative district would sponsor a Green New Deal bill. And I had a very specific reason. One, well, I had 2 reasons. My first reason is that I wanted everybody to pay attention to it. I wrote the Green New Deal bill with the labor unions in Maine. I think we all know that there hasn't been the best relationship between labor and climate when it comes to building our movements. And so I really wanted a climate bill that was rooted in rural communities like mine, and that could try and translate some of the momentum that we're feeling around climate into a more rural context. So I thought if I called the Green New Deal, everyone would pay attention to it. We could have this big conversation about what our climate movement looks like, how we're talking to each other, the people that are part of our coalitions, and we could maybe broaden our umbrella just a little bit. And that worked actually quite well. So we were the first Green New Deal legislation in the country to be endorsed by an AFL-CIO affiliate after the national one said no thank you. And you can just see some of the organizing and faces that we brought in. We also, since my background is in youth climate organizing, I made sure that the day of our public hearing was the same day as the Youth Climate Day of Action in Augusta, so that young folks could come and testify and have their voices heard. And it turned into a really amazing public hearing because almost everyone who testified was from a union or was a young person. And to me, how we transition to a renewable energy economy is just as important as the fact that we actually do it. And we do not want to replicate the same injustices of climate change in this transition. So that's why we call it a just transition. And for me, that means making sure that rural voices, working class voices are prioritized in the climate conversation. So the Maine Green New Deal is passed. These are the super exciting moments when it happened. The left one is when the committee approved it, and the right one is Governor Mills signing it into law. And that was so exciting. I just wanted to add one more little piece here. So many people ask me how we won in District 88, and my answer is always very simple. It's listening and respecting what the other person is saying. I was listening this week to some of the voice memos that I took while I was canvassing. After I had a hard door or something like that, I would just talk to myself on my phone. And at the beginning of the campaign, I talk about, that I consider myself to be a very progressive person and how challenging it is to hear some of the really strong anti-climate, anti-immigrant, anti-welfare thinking that's out there. But by just simply listening and respecting the people that I was talking to, the people in my community, I discovered something really powerful, which is that we're all frustrated. I remember this one conversation I had with an older woman who was telling me how she can't afford to retire, she has to sell her home, and I remember she just got out of the shower because she had to go to work, and it was heartbreaking. And then she started telling me about how it's so unfair that immigrants coming into our country get benefits and she doesn't get the benefits that she's worked for her whole life. So that's a narrative or a logic that I don't agree with, but I can understand that frustration. I had another conversation with a couple who was very pro-life, very anti-immigrant, and very pro-Trump, and we had a very intense conversation. I was listening to this conversation, and it was, I'm not even gonna tell you some of the things that we talked about, but in the end, we talked about these really, really, really hard, controversial issues. And in the end, I remarked that we ended our conversation by agreeing that you can be a good person and a good neighbor while disagreeing on some of these issues. And so that to me is how I approach politics these days. I don't have a lot of space for hatred or extremism on either side. But I think there's so much common ground that we just haven't taken the time to uncover because we're not knocking on those doors, because we're using the same strategies every year. We're running the same kinds of campaigns, and we're excluding the same people. And those people are just getting more and more frustrated. And how understandable is that? Because they're frustrated for the very reasons that we're frustrated, that no one is listening to our voices when it comes to climate change. So. To me is why there's so much power and opportunity in rural organizing, so much political momentum to be built, and why I'm so excited to be doing all of this work with you. So thank you again, and have a great weekend.
You folks have questions for Chloe, and Ian may beseech you to grab the other mic. Where'd it go?
Over here,
Do you folks have questions for Chloe? Thank you, Chloe, by the way. That's really an amazing story and amazing life's work, and clearly you are not done yet. She is running for Senate. So, do you folks have questions, thoughts, comments?
Thank you, Chloe. That was great. Has this inspired a whole new crop of other candidates in them?
Well, I mean, hard to say. I have a lot of young people reaching out to me, and just a lot of folks in general who want to run for office and want to know how to do it, and lots of people wondering about rural races as well. So I don't know if we were the cause of that directly, but I'd like to think that we kind of created an opening to have that conversation and to show that it can be done in communities that we haven't paid attention to. Like the Dems didn't even send people to help us with GOTV for the election because they think that we wouldn't win. So, you know, real grassroots movements can overcome so much of that. And I think that that's inspiring, at least to me. Yeah.
Does Maine have an Emerge program as so many other states do?
Maine does have Emerge. Does everyone know what Emerge is? Emerge is a program that trains Democratic women to run for office, and they're in some states, but not all states. And we do have it in Maine, and I did go through Emerge before I ran. Amazing. Emerge is incredible. I recommend it to every Democratic woman that I encounter.
A question off of the Slido. How do you find the strength to have these difficult conversations day in and day out?
That's such a personal question. Good question. I mean, to me in this work, I spend a lot of time talking with the folks that I agree with, and I find a lot more power in talking with the folks that I don't agree with. I feel like we can't grow our movements if we're not bringing in new folks, and we can't bring in new folks if we're not going and talking to new folks. So, you know, we all have our own space and our own role and our own way of engaging with this work, and this is just the way that I feel like doing it. And it's also my home, you know, it's where I grew up. It's not a point of view or a way of living that I can turn my back on because it's what raised me. And so if I'm not willing to engage with my hometown, then I don't really know why I would live there.
Question over here. Can you talk about Maine's instant runoff voting?
Ranked choice voting?
Yeah.
Yes, we do have ranked choice voting in Maine. I love ranked choice voting. I think we should have ranked choice voting at every level of government. I mean, to me, representing my district, I am for ranked choice voting because it gives the power for third parties to run for office way more easily. For the same reason that I support open primaries, and for districts like mine that are very, you know, have more independents than Democrats or Republicans, I think that's so important.
You might want to explain it to those here who don't know what it is.
Oh yes, does anyone not know what ranked choice voting is?
Yeah.
Okay, so ranked choice voting is yeah, like an instant runoff. So instead of having an election and then with 5 people and no one gets over 50%, and then you have a runoff a couple weeks later, when you go to the ballot, you literally rank your candidates on the ballot, and the runoff happens instantaneously. So it really encourages third parties to run for office because you have like almost an equal chance of winning. It's kind of confusing to explain, but it makes so much sense when you actually vote that way.
My question is, how do you make a living? I don't know, I'm right here. In Vermont, our legislators are not paid very much. It's only a 5 or 6 month job.
Yeah.
Then they have to support themselves. And it sounds as if the campaigning you did was full-time for months. So how do you finance this?
Yes, that's an amazing question. One of the reasons why politics is so inaccessible to folks who really aren't retired or have independent wealth. For me, so I spent the year before I was running just working a ton and saving money so that I could work part-time while I campaigned. And I work part-time while I'm in the legislature, and then I work, you know, I have all my other work right now too. So all together, I can do it. I'm lucky because I don't have a family. I just have to support myself. I don't really do that much. So I can work. Yeah. I mean, like, you know, yeah, okay. You know, my hours are flexible, my jobs are flexible, so I can work before I go to State House, I can work when I get home, and that's a privilege that I have to be able to do that with my life. But that's not accessible to everybody, which is why it's so important that, like, my message isn't everyone should run for office, because that's not accessible or realistic for so many folks. My message is we all gotta do what we can in the way that we can, and this is the way that I can do it. So there we go.
Chloe, one last question for you, which is just to be respectful of your and everyone's time. There's so many inspiring pieces of what you just did and what you have done, and knowing that rural Maine has a lot of similarities to rural Vermont. What sort of last advice would you give us in terms of like how we can, the best next step for those of us who want to move from caring passionately about climate to broaden our movement to bring everyone in, either in the legislative section and in the electoral arena? Your last best piece of advice.
I mean, the way that I approach it is I think, what would District 88 think? You know, when you think about rural America, what would those folks say? What would somebody who voted for Trump say? What is that perspective? And how can we, yeah, you know, it's tricky because a lot of it is very destructive, but also a lot of it is so related to what we're doing. So in the messaging that we're using, in the work that we're doing, in the campaigns that we're running, how do we make space for all of those people? And I think that you know, there's just so many ways that can happen, from building coalitions with labor, for example, to running campaigns that have a different universe. So you're talking to Republicans instead of just Democrats. You know, that kind of conversation, that kind of intentionality, that kind of relationship goes way beyond whatever hearing or vote or day of action we can have.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Chloe. Just a couple last minute logistics before you go. We will send out a conference evaluation. We will follow up and share or post the PowerPoint presentations and any of the materials that we've gotten from the amazing workshop presenters and the panelists, and keynote and everything. I just want to say a deep, sincere appreciation for you all for spending your Saturday with us, for all the folks who lent their time and expertise on the panels and in the workshops, for our sponsors. Again, really grateful for all of you. We clearly have shared collective mission, and our mission is to finally make progress this upcoming legislative session and beyond. There are some concrete ideas on the table. We're going to follow up with you to look forward to really implementing those ideas. So lastly, there are still lost and found things. People are bugging me about it. Please, if you have lost anything, I'm going to take this up to the front desk. Please look there. Glasses are important. I would also say we have food, and if you don't want to go home on an empty stomach and want to make sure you have one more conversation with some of the amazing people who are in this room dedicating your free time to this essential work, please grab a snack in the upstairs Steamboat Lounge and drive safely going home in your cars. Soon they will be fossil fuel free. Let's do this.
Thank you.